the Baron's daughter who refused to marry a man twice her age. How many times must a woman say no before the world finally listens? Before the scandal, before the Marquis's fall, before she became a symbol of resistance. Seraphina was just a Baron's daughter, in a dress too tight, and a destiny sealed by alliances. But that night, at the table in the Great Hall, she spoke a single word, and nothing would ever be the same. The candles in the Great Hall flickered low, their flames bending like frightened servants in the draft of winter. At the far end of the long table sat Lord Halvern, a baron of modest lands but stubborn pride. His face was carved with years of ambition, and tonight that ambition glimmered in his eyes like a hunter's knife. Beside him sat his daughter, Seraphina, 17 summers old, yet her gaze carried a weight her father mistook for meekness. Her hands were folded in her lap, pale against the velvet of her gown, while her father spoke in tones meant to impress the guest of honor. The guest was Lord Veynar, a Marquis twice her age, with a smile like sour wine and fingers heavy with rings. His estates stretched wide, his influence wider still, and his cruelty was whispered in every hall. Widowed twice, his first wife had wasted away in illness. His second had fallen from a balcony none dared investigate. Yet here he sat, smirking across the table, as if Seraphina were already his property. Her father raised a goblet. It is settled then, a union that will raise the Halvern name higher than ever. My daughter will wed the Marquis of Veynar before spring. The servants froze. Even the fire seemed to listen. Seraphina lifted her gaze, calm and clear, and in that silence, she spoke words no woman of her station had ever dared. No. The goblet paused in her father's hand. The Marquis's smile cracked into disbelief. The word had not been shouted. It had not been pleaded. It had been spoken with the precision of a blade. Lord Halvern's knuckles whitened. No, he repeated, as though the sound itself were alien. Seraphina's heart hammered, but her voice did not tremble. I will not marry him. The room erupted. Servants gasped. The steward dropped his tray. The Marquis rose half out of his chair, red with outrage. You dare refuse me? He spat. A child with nothing but a barren scrap of land? But Seraphina remained seated, her spine straight, her hands steady. She looked not at the Marquis, but at her father. If you sell me, you will not just bury your daughter. You will bury your legacy. I would rather live in disgrace than die in his house. The hall fell into a stunned silence. For the first time in her life, she had thrown a stone into the still pond of her fate, and the ripples were already crashing against the walls of power. Her refusal would not only shame her father, it would ignite a storm that could strip her of everything: family, safety, name. But Seraphina knew something they did not. She had no crown, no title beyond her father's, but she had a mind sharpened by years of quiet observation, and a spirit that had never learned how to bow. The Baron's daughter would not kneel, and the nobility was about to learn that there is nothing more dangerous than a woman who says no. The word no did not leave the Great Hall. It multiplied. By dawn, servants whispered it in kitchens, messengers carried it down roads, and by nightfall it echoed in the corridors of nobles who drank scandal like wine. The Baron's daughter has refused marriage. Some laughed, others raged, but all agreed. It was dangerous. Lord Halvern's fury was a storm that night. His boots struck the stone floor as he paced her chamber, his voice thunderous. Do you understand what you've done? You've humiliated me before a Marquis. You've doomed this house to ruin. Seraphina stood by the window, pale moonlight cutting her figure into silver and shadow. She did not cry, though her hands trembled. I've saved myself from a cage, she answered softly. His palm struck her cheek, and for a heartbeat she staggered. The sting burned, but her eyes did not falter. She looked at him as if to remind him that pain was not the same as obedience. That night, he ordered her locked within her chambers, the windows barred, the door watched by guards. She was a prisoner in her own home. Days turned to weeks and the punishment deepened. Her gowns were taken, replaced with coarse dresses meant for scullery maids. She was made to eat at the servants' table, where her sisters smirked as though watching a wolf stripped of its teeth. The Marquis of Venar spread venomous words through the city. She is ungrateful, unfit, mad. Suitors disappeared, alliances withered. Invitations to the Halvern estate grew rare. Her refusal had not just wounded her father's pride, it was poisoning his ambitions. But humiliation has strange alchemy. It either breaks a spirit or tempers it. Seraphina endured the glares of servants who had once bowed, now emboldened to sneer. She endured her sister's whispers, bastard heart, cursed blood, as they paraded in silks before her. And yet, instead of withering, she began to watch. She listened in silence to every careless word the nobles uttered at table, every careless confession the steward muttered after wine. She noticed debts that chained men more tightly than honor, affairs that could destroy reputations, secrets more dangerous than swords. One night, the steward's keys jingled against his belt as he dozed outside her chamber. With soft hands and sharper patience, she stole them, slipping into the library she had been forbidden. The fire in the hearth was low, but the shelves gleamed with knowledge. She pulled down ledgers, guild records, law scrolls. She discovered loopholes buried in dull ink, laws her father had never bothered to read. In the hush of that room, Seraphina realized something. Power did not always belong to those with crowns. It belonged to those who could read between the lines. Her rebellion became quiet, patient. When she was forced to sew with her sisters, she stitched faster, finer, memorizing patterns she could later sell. When made to toil in the kitchens, she learned how accounts were balanced or cheated. She learned the prices of flour, the shortage of spices, the bribes paid to avoid inspection. Every humiliation became an education. And yet, her defiance had a cost. The Marquis returned weeks later, not with roses, but with threats. He cornered her in the courtyard, his breath sour with wine, his smile cruel. "You think you can shame me, little dove? I could end your father's house with a word. I could take everything you love and crush it. And when I am done, no one will even remember your name." He gripped her wrist until she winced, but her gaze cut sharper than his fingers. "Better forgotten than chained to you," she whispered. He left her bruised, but her spirit burned brighter. At night, she pressed her wrist against the moonlight, staring at the mark. She knew then that her fight was no longer about refusing one man. It was about refusing a world built on obedience. The backlash grew heavier. Nobles whispered that she was cursed, her name a stain. Her father threatened to send her to a convent, locking her away until the end of her days. Her sisters mocked that she would die alone, nameless and penniless. But alone in her cell-like chamber, Seraphina whispered to herself the same words she had spoken at the table. No, it was not a word of refusal anymore. It was a vow. If they locked her away, she would break the lock. If they silenced her, she would write words louder than any voice. If they sold her, she would make herself priceless. The Baron's daughter had been born into obedience, but humiliation had taught her something far greater. How to resist, how to endure, how to see power where others saw only chains. She was not merely refusing a marriage. She was declaring war on the very fate the world had written for her. They tried to make her smaller, so she learned to move where large men could not. The guards at her door dozed after midnight. She learned the rhythm of their sleep by the weight of their breathing. The steward's keys sang when he drank. She learned which teeth in the ring were filed thin by years of use. And the house itself, meant to hold her, became a map of possibilities that no one but she could see. The dumbwaiter shaft that ran like a hollow bone through 4 floors. The servants' corridor that met the chapel stairs behind an unmarked panel. The narrow slit of a window where a whisper could escape to the outer yard without a face to betray it. On the 3rd week of her confinement, she sent her first message. A scrap of linen, hemmed with needlework so fine it could have been prayer, wrapped around a sentence in a kitchen girl's hand. "Meet me in the chapel when the bell strikes 1. She left it beneath a loaf on the pantry shelf she knew the butler's niece would never resist stealing. The niece, Mara, precise fingers and a mouth that never stayed shut, came in the night with eyes wide, expecting romance or scandal, and finding instead a girl of her own age with a noble's face and a servant's hunger for survival. "If I am to be sold like linen," Seraphina said quietly, "I must first learn how linen is sold." That was how it began, with Mara's gossip-turned ledger. The girl carried news through the house the way a wick carries flame, but under Seraphina's questions the fires changed color. Which merchants gave credit, and which gave rope to hang with? Which steward pocketed coin on the road from barn to cellar? Which footman played dice with men who wore the Marquis's crest in their rings? Mara returned from each errand with carelessly overheard facts that Seraphina filtered until patterns emerged. The first pattern was debt. Her father's accounts were a swan on black water, elegant above, paddling for life below. The second was fear. Everyone owed someone, and most owed the Marquis of Venar. That was the Marquis's true weapon, Seraphina realized. Not rings, not armies, ledgers. So she learned to write them. By candlelight, beneath the nose of the guard whose snores creaked like an ungreased hinge, she drafted two kinds of letters. The first were apologies in her father's hand, copied from old notes she found in the library drawer he thought no one knew. She used them to forge delays, requests for more time that bought her space to move. The second were inquiries in no hand at all. Plain, respectful notices sent to minor creditors promising part payment from the Halvern household if goods were delivered discreetly to the laundry door. Flour, salt, cloth scraps, herbs. None of it looked like rebellion. All of it was preparation. With Mara and two laundry women who had stitched through worse winters than this, Seraphina turned scraps into the kind of finished pieces that households always need. Mended linens, repaired laces, seams that lay flat as breath. She sent them out quietly to houses that could not afford tailors, but hated to show it. Coin trickled back. Not enough to boast of, but enough to learn with. Enough to prove that refusal did not have to mean ruin. The Marquis replied to refusal with spectacle. He sent a bolt of poisoned silk, purple so vivid it bruised the eyes, to the Halvern Hall as a bridal gift, and when Lord Halvern paraded it at supper like a treasure, the Marquis' men spread the story through the city. The Baron's daughter would bow yet. Seraphina watched her father's fingers flex on the fabric and measured how far a man would go to save his pride. That night, she tucked a scrap of the silk into a small packet bound for the dyer's quarter with a note. "Tell me what this costs, and who will be paid." The answer returned 2 days later in a dyer's bitter scrawl. "More than your father would ever pay. Less than the Marquis would spend to make you his." The bill was already settled. The trap was baited in her own dining room. If the Marquis weaponized rumor, Seraphina would weaponize memory. She began to ask questions that seemed like nothing. Why did the steward wince when winter pears were mentioned? Because the Marquis had delayed a shipment last year to starve a competing household's feast. Why did the chaplain avoid the south transept? Because a girl had flung herself from that balcony 10 summers ago and landed like a broken lily 2 steps from the pew. Whose balcony had it been? The Marquis's second wife. Illness, they had called it then. Seraphina wrote that word in the margin of her notes and drew a line through it until the paper thinned. There were other allies to be made beyond kitchens and chapels. In the market, a boy limped through the crowds hawking pins and needles with a singer's insistence. He had a brother at the gatehouse and a mother who did laundry for 3 minor lords. He also had eyes like flint. She overpaid for a handful of needles and said, "I don't need pins, I need a path." He led her through lanes so narrow even gossip had to go single file, up a stair into a room with a view of rooftops and the habit of eavesdropping. From there, she watched the Marquis's carriage roll smooth as false charm toward a townhouse she did not recognize, one without crest, without guards, with windows that wore curtains thick enough to smother a scream. The boy told her the street's name, and she wrote it down next to illness and balcony. Seraphina's father tightened her prison each time she found a window. He sent away Mara, replaced the guard with one who did not sleep, forbade the servants to speak within 10 paces of her door. He thought silence would starve her. Instead, it taught her to multiply bread. She hid notes in hymnals, stitched messages into bodices, paid for a rumor with the truth of another. When her sisters taunted her with news of the Marquis's hunting party, a show of strength in their father's woods, She took the taunt and turned it. Hunters drink, she thought, and drunk men speak. She bribed the stable boy to tie an old brass bell at the end of the furthest bridle so the sound would tell her, from her barred window, when the hunt returned and which hooves carried secrets. Secrets came faster than hooves. The turning point arrived on a day of service. The Duchess of the neighboring shire, no friend of Lord Halvern but less a friend of Vanar, announced a charity feast for the poor. Nobles would pour wine for beggars, women would tie kerchiefs with clean hands they'd never used for work, and everyone would be seen doing what they preferred to hear about instead. Seraphina begged to go. "Let me serve," she said to her father, with a humility honed to a blade. "Let the city see our house among the generous." He weighed appearances and agreed. He kept her under the eye of the steward. He miscalculated what an eye can miss when a mind decides to see. At the feast, the Duchess's guests wore smiles like plumage. Seraphina wore plain wool and the memory of the balcony. She moved from table to table, pouring broth, listening, and there, 3 seats from the head, sat a woman with a veil too thick for a lady and a posture too careful for a servant. A bruise ghosted beneath her veil's edge. When their eyes met, Seraphina saw it, the flinch that has learned to smile. She set the bowl down, as if it were an altar gift, and murmured, "I know." The woman blinked, and in that blink was a lifetime. They did not speak again. They did not need to. The next day, a bundle arrived at the chapel door wrapped in plain cloth, a ribbon from a gown stitched in the house on the street with the smothering curtains, a scrap of paper with 2 names, and a tiny glass vial that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Illness. The balcony's echo rang at last. Evidence is chalk until it finds a slate. Seraphina needed a slate the council would be forced to read. She could not accuse. She could only arrange for truth to arrive where lies had wagered there would be only rumor. So she wrote another set of letters, this time in her own hand and under her own seal. To the Duchess who hosted the feast, she wrote gratitude and admiration and requested an audience to speak of a matter of women's safety. To the city apothecary, she wrote a donation for the poor, earmarked for antidotes and for the examination of vials left anonymously for identification. To the head clerk of the council archives, she requested a reading of marriage contracts and death records for the sake of my mother's genealogies. Each letter did only what it said. Together, they did everything else. Meanwhile, she built her own coin. With Mara exiled, she recruited a weaver's widow whose pride had not survived her husband's debt, but whose hands could coax strength from thread. They launched a small, private shop out of the laundry door, selling repairs and commissions under the name Notion and Needle. The first clients were servants from houses that could not afford to let their ladies' hems drag. The second were ladies who preferred quiet over the chatter of modistes. With coin came control. With control, a quieter kind of safety. The shop ledger grew tidy. Her father's ledgers did not. The Marquis retaliated by cutting off the Halvern credit at 2 banks. Lord Halvern turned on his daughter like a cornered wolf. "You have cost me everything," he hissed. "You will marry where I say." She looked down at the bruise faded to yellow at her wrist and said, "Father, if I must be bartered, then barter me for something worthy. Barter me for law." He did not understand. He never had. That she was not bargaining for her hand. She was bargaining for a moment and a room. The room arrived as the Duchess's salon, peacocks and blades hidden in coiffures. The Duchess received Seraphina with a gaze that measured and found iron. "You asked to speak of women's safety," she said, the words powdered like sugar to hide the arsenic beneath. "Do you mean safety from boredom?" Laughter tinkled, the room's eyes cut. Seraphina curtsied as if curtsies were a language she had never hated. "I mean safety from balconies," she answered softly. The laughter died like a candle pinched between fingers. She did not accuse. She asked questions. Could the apothecary tell them why some wives died with blood too thin to clot? Could the clerk explain why certain death records were signed by the same trembling hand, a steward whose wages came from the Marquis's house? Could anyone remember why the first Marchioness's dowry was never fully accounted for? She laid the ribbon on the table, as if it were a napkin, and the tiny vial as if it were perfume. She let the Duchess lift it and smell the almonds that meant nothing and everything. She quoted the marriage law that said repeat widowers of noble rank must submit to review before a third wedding in respect for the peace of households. She smiled as if asking for help, not offering a noose. The Duchess leaned back with the satisfaction of a woman who had just been handed a blade with which to cut a rival and pretend she was pruning a rose. "How thoughtful to bring this to me," she purred. "We shall, of course, recommend an inquiry, for the safety of women." Around the room, faces arranged themselves into virtue. No one said the Marquis's name. Everyone thought it. Seraphina left with compliments clinging like burrs to her sleeves, and with a date the Duchess whispered to her maid, the council would meet. That night the steward tried to search Seraphina's chamber. He found nothing but psalms and mended cuffs. He did not think to search the chapel's hollow under the altar where Mara had once hidden pastry. He did not think to follow the needle seller's boy across rooftops to the apothecary's door. He did not think to add 2 and 2 and watch a balcony appear. When the council sat, Seraphina was not called, but she was present as Lady of the Halvern household, a title her father had never let her wear and now could not prevent. The room was full of old oaths and fresh perfumes. The apothecary spoke first, careful, exact. Traces consistent with bitter almond in the hair and nails of 2 deceased noblewomen exhumed at the Duchess's gracious request. The head clerk spoke next, hands steady as ledgers. Irregularities in the accounting of dowries, witnesses who could not be found, a steward's hand that shook the same in grief or greed. No one accused. Everyone compared notes. The Marquis, invited and bored, smiled like a man listening to a play staged by peasants. He lifted his ringed hand to hide a yawn, and a woman in a veil stood from the back bench and lifted her own hand, bare, with a scar on the wrist in the shape of a grip. "I am not dead," she said simply. "Not yet." It was the woman from the feast. The room turned, the whip of attention cracking. She told no sordid details. She did not need to. She named a townhouse and a knight and a physician who had been paid to call bruises delicacy. She named a steward who whispered illness until words lost meaning. And she named the balcony, because sometimes a story only needs one height to be true. The council did not roar. It cooled. Cold is more dangerous. The magistrate announced that, by law, any man seeking a third marriage under such cloud must submit to delay and oversight. In the meantime, his financial levers would be audited. A lesser man would have blustered. The Marquis of Veynar smiled. "For the safety of women," he said silkily, and bowed. To Seraphina it felt like watching a snake remove its own skin, only to show newer scales beneath. That night her father drank until his jaw went slack. "You have set wolves on our door," he slurred. "Do you think the Marquis will forgive? He will come for you by law, or by lane." Seraphina took the cup from his hand and set it down, gently, as if setting down a life. "Then we will meet him in both places," she said. "And we will not be home when he comes to call." She had one more move to make before the endgame began. She returned to the library and unrolled the dowry law again, the ink broken in places where men's fingers had worn it thin. It said that a father may pledge a daughter's hand and goods. It did not say the daughter could not pledge her skills, her time, her mind elsewhere first. So she drafted another charter, notion and needle transformed into a consortium. Seamstresses, launderers, menders, a handful of discreet modistes with clients who did not like to be seen buying dresses in daylight. They pooled coin, they pooled risk, they set prices women could live on. They wrote terms that required payment in full before any hem touched a noble floor. And they signed it, each one, beneath Seraphina's name, because some walls only fall when many hands push. Word reached the Marquis, of course. Word always does when it is inconvenient. His carriage stopped outside Halvern House one frost-clear morning. He entered as if he owned the air and called Seraphina by the name of a possession. She met him at the threshold, flanked by 2 laundry women who had never seen a Marquis up close and were not impressed. "You have made enemies among women," he said pleasantly. They are not my most dangerous kind of enemy." "No," she agreed. "We are your last." He offered her a bargain: apology, quiet marriage, the end of scandal in exchange for the end of her voice. She listened as one listens to a clock when deciding whether to throw it in the river. "No," she said again, the word more precise for every time it was forged. "You cannot imagine a woman whose safety is not the price of your comfort. That is why you will lose." He left without slamming a door. Men like him never slam, they promise. 2 nights later, a rider landed in the mud outside the Halvern gate, a writ clutched in his damp fist. The bank called its loans. Lord Halvern slumped like a tent with a broken pole. "You've done this," he whispered at Seraphina, not as accusation now, but as admission. He finally believed she had the power to move the ground. "We have 1 month. 1 month is a lifetime if you measure it in hours," she said, and she began to. She sold nothing sentimental because nothing sentimental had ever been given to her. She mortgaged the old hunting lodge her father ignored. She brokered a contract between the Duchess's kitchens and the seamstresses' consortium for linens and staff uniforms at a fair price. "For the safety of women," the Duchess murmured with a smile that had found a better use. She turned the laundry into a salon of purpose, where grim women, as the girls named themselves with pride, sewed by day and read by night. She delivered a set of accounts to the bank showing the Halvern house could meet its obligations if interest was not increased for sport. She wrote to 3 small lords the Marquis had strangled with credit and offered them a way out. Combine their orders through the consortium. Pay less, owe less, need him less. She used the ovens of humiliation to harden clay into brick. When the month turned, the house did not fall. It sagged, then straightened. The bank grudgingly extended terms. The Duchess's uniforms arrived, neat as ranks. The seamstresses ate meat on Sundays. The Marquis's steward found his requests for flattery unanswered. And Seraphina, still locked in a house that did not love her, stood at a window and held a city in her head like a map she could fold and unfold with one hand. The clash did not end in a sword song. It ended in the rustle of papers, the creak of a pen, the quiet hiss of a wick snuffed between fingers that had learned to touch flame and not be burned. Seraphina had not toppled the Marquis. She had done something crueler to a man who lived on obedience. She had made his threats cost him. She had turned his levers to stone. And still she knew he would not stop. Men whose power is built on women's silence never stop. They only change rooms. So when the council's next summons came, this time not to debate but to decide, Seraphina did not flinch. She had gathered ribbon and poison and law and hunger and hands. Now she would gather the city. On the morning of the hearing, she tied her hair with a strip of plain linen and walked past her guards as if they had always been escorts. "Where are you going?" her father asked, exhausted, broken pride hanging on him like damp cloth. "To end this," she said, "and to begin what comes after." "But thou?" The council chamber smelled of wax and damp stone, a place built not for justice, but for display. The Marquis sat draped in velvet, his ringed fingers resting on the table like claws disguised as ornaments. His eyes glittered with amusement, as if the proceedings were a play staged for his delight. He expected victory, because victory had always been his inheritance. But Seraphina entered not as a pawn to be moved, but as a queen who had learned to carve her own throne from the bones of injustice. She wore no jewels, no silks, only a gown of plain dark fabric, and at her breast the smallest of emblems, a needle threaded with red silk glinting in the light. The room whispered, and the whisper grew. Everyone had heard by now of the consortium of women, of the bank delays, of the Duchess's uniforms, of the Marquis's sudden loss of hold on debts he once twisted like chains. The magistrate cleared his throat. "Lord Vaynar," he said slowly, "you stand accused of improprieties in marriage, coercion of households, and manipulation of debts that threaten the stability of the realm." The Marquis only smiled, as if the words were harmless music. "And who, pray, accuses me?" The answer came not from the magistrate, but from the back of the chamber, where women rose one after another. The veiled wife who had survived his poisons, the weaver's widow, who now had her name on contracts instead of whispers. Mara, smuggled back into the city, carrying ledgers marked with the steward's trembling hand. Even the Duchess, her voice sweet as venom, added her weight. For the safety of women. And then Seraphina stepped forward. Not to accuse, no. She had learned accusation could be dismissed as hysteria. She came to prove. She laid down letters, contracts, the ribbon, the vial, the testimony of servants and noblewomen alike. She spoke not with fury, but with clarity, and that was her greatest weapon. Clarity forced the council to see what they had chosen not to see. The Marquis's smile faltered. By the time the session ended, the verdict was sealed. His assets were seized, his marriages annulled by law, his authority stripped. The man who once controlled the fate of half the city now had nothing but a hollow name. And Seraphina? She was no longer a prisoner in her father's halls. She stood outside the council chamber, and the crowd that had gathered did not call her a daughter to be bartered. They called her Lady Halvern. Some even whispered, protector of women. For the first time, she had a title she had carved with her own hands, not one inherited from a man who would cage her. She returned to her consortium not as its founder in shadows, but as its leader in light. The women who had stitched and starved now stitched and thrived. Their shop became a guild, their guild a movement. Contracts bore not just men's names, but women's, written in ink so dark it would never fade. Her father, broken by debts and stripped of authority, tried once more to assert control. "You are still my daughter," he muttered, bitterness cracking his voice. "No," she answered, standing tall, her eyes steady. "I am my own." The city cheered not for vengeance but for transformation. The girl who had been mocked, despised, and confined had become the woman who rewrote the rules of survival. Her victory was not a crown or a marriage, but something far greater. Freedom, for herself and for every woman who came after. And so, Seraphina did not just change the fate of her own house, she redefined what was possible for every woman around her. But power gained is power challenged. And in the echo of the court, as the Marquis's name was erased from the halls, other names stirred in the shadows. Uneasy, because when a woman rises, the world must decide, will it listen, or will it try to silence her again?